Hello everyone! I'm back with another bookmark design. I'm trying something new this time, giving narration a go instead of just music. Bear with me here, I'm absolutely terrible at public speaking. I get really nervous, but I'm gonna give this a go. So for this bookmark, I started out with some Strathmore watercolor paper, and I taped it down on my mat. If I had a hardboard, I would tape it to that, but I haven't managed to get one of those yet. Next, I got out some of my distress ink because I plan on doing some ink blending. The colors I chose to blend are Tumbled Glass, Salty Ocean, Mermaid Lagoon, Blueprint Sketch, and Hickory Smoke. My Tumbled Glass ink pad was getting pretty dry, so I ended up having to smush it right onto the paper and then blend it. I chose these colors because I'm trying to go for like an early evening night sky here. When you're trying to blend a sky to make it look more realistic, you're going to want the colors to be darker at the top and lighter at the bottom. I wanted the top to be even darker, but sadly I don't have the black distress ink, so I grabbed my regular black ink and blended that on. Next I sprayed some water in my hand and dropped flicks and big drops onto the paper. Distress ink is a water-based ink that reactivates with water. So when you add water and let it sit a little while, you get this bleaching effect when you soak it up with a towel. I accidentally dropped some bigger drops than I meant to, so I just went over those with some ink again and covered them. And I kind of liked the effect that gave anyways. The next thing I did was I pulled out my watercolor set. This is a Reeves watercolor set. It's fairly cheap at Michael's, and it has a white in it, which I don't use a lot for watercoloring, but you can use it for effects like this. I put a little dab of it onto a block and sprayed it with some water to water it down, and then just flicked it off of the edge. I liked the way it was coming out at this point, but I did want the top to be darker, so I came back in with my dark inks. Making a night sky like this, or a galaxy, is all about layering. Now we need to add some more stars. This time I'm going to try and make them a little bit bigger by getting closer to the paper when I splatter them. And I was happy with that, so now it's time to clean up a little bit. This was probably a good video to start narrating on because I'm about to make a lot of mistakes and you guys get to see them and I get to talk about them a little bit. I love pulling the tape off of a piece like this. It's just so crisp and makes me feel like an artist. Next I took my paper trimmer. This is just a Fisker's paper trimmer from Walmart, and I cut it down to size for the bookmark that I need. And I'll have an extra piece left over to use on another project. Okay, so here's where all the mistakes start happening. I pulled out some stamps to start embossing the sky. I used some stars and I found a moon stamp. And the mistake that I made here was I didn't test the paper with my embossing powder before trying to emboss. When you have a heavily inked piece of paper like this, you need to test it before you emboss it because the embossing powder will stick to everything if it's still wet, even in the slightest amount. Even though I did use my powder tool here to try and prevent anything from sticking, it didn't matter because this paper is so saturated with ink that it needs to dry for a long time before the embossing powder will not stick to it. And see right here, this is where everything got stuck to it. So I cleaned up all of the powder and I'm going to attempt to emboss it again after drying it for a long time. I used my powder tool and this time I tested the paper before I inked it. And it's a good thing I did because it still wasn't dry enough. So I used my heat tool to try and dry it some more, and then I tested it again and it seemed dry enough this time. So I inked up my stamps with some Bookmark ink and attempted to emboss again. So you'll see, even though I tested it this time, I didn't test it far enough down on the paper, so there were still some mistakes. So at this point, I decided to just brush off some of the embossing powder and keep the stars that did stamp properly. So with the rest of the stamping, I had to get a little creative. Because I had already stamped it with the Bookmark ink, it was going to take a really long time to dry because that ink is so sticky. So I decided to re-stamp it and then use a paintbrush to brush off the embossing powder that I didn't need and make my moon. So next I needed to stamp the stars under the moon, and I started by using my powder tool and testing the paper. When I tested the paper, I noticed that there was still some residue of that Bookmark ink on there. Instead of waiting a really long time and trying to dry off this Bookmark ink, I decided to just stamp that star in the same spot. So I poured my embossing powder again and embossed that little bit of residue of the star, and I'm going to just stamp over it again with more Bookmark ink and emboss over the top of it. This part of the process turned out to be so much more difficult than it should have been if I had just tested the paper to begin with. Believe it or not, these aren't even the biggest mistakes that I made on this bookmark. So I cleaned everything up and then moved on to the next part of this bookmark. I got out some plastic to fuse together to make a shaker bookmark. Next I pulled out all of my sequins and my little dish, and I made my little sequin mix. I decided to go with mostly clear sequins and a few blue ones. Most of my sequins I got from Amazon or from Michael's, but I will put all of my materials used in the description below. Next I got my white gel pen out to add a few more stars. This is the Uniball Signo white gel pen. It's my favorite gel pen. Next I took my Wink of Stella glitter brush pen and went over the entire thing with it. I just wanted it to be really sparkly. I decided that I wanted a black border around this bookmark. Taping it to the black paper also makes it a little bit more sturdy. So I got out my plastic and I got out my fuse tool. You're going to want to start heating up your fuse tool about 15 minutes before you use it so that it's nice and hot. Just using my Fiskars paper cutter to trim off the plastic that I don't need. My really big, awful, huge mistake is coming up, and you probably won't even notice when it happens. I like to roll up just a piece of scrap paper to put my sequins in. Okay, here comes the mistake. It's right here. I roll that back and I hit my thumb with it. You can't tell in the video because it's a little bit off camera, but I hit that right into my thumb and it hurts so bad because this tool is extremely hot. At this point though, I was so close to finishing that I just stuck through until the end, dealing with the pain. I have a lovely blister on my thumb right now, so let that be a lesson to you to be very careful with this tool. This was my first time burning myself with it, and now I know to be extremely careful with it in the future. I cut out some sparkly twine and put that through for the little tassel, and this bookmark is done. I love the way that it shakes and all the glitter moves. Thanks for watching.